There are moments inside institutions that never make it into official statements, never appear in the briefing notes handed to journalists, never get confirmed by any spokesman standing at any podium. They happen in private rooms between people who know exactly what is at stake, and they leave a mark on everything that follows without anyone outside ever being told precisely what was said. What happened between William and Charles in the weeks before the second anniversary of the coronation is one of those moments. And the reason it matters is not the confrontation itself, it is the document that made the confrontation unavoidable. The document surfaced during a review that William's legal team had been conducting since the early part of the year. It was not an investigation in the dramatic sense of that word. It was the kind of methodical work that happens in any large institution when someone decides to audit the paper trail behind a series of significant decisions made during a period of transition. In this case, the transition being examined was the period between the death of Queen Elizabeth in September 2022 and the coronation of Charles III in May 2023. 8 months during which the royal household reorganized itself around a new monarch, new titles were assigned, new roles were defined, and a considerable number of administrative decisions were made that would shape the institution for decades. Most of those decisions were routine, some of them were not. The document William's team found was dated 6 weeks before the coronation. It was a private authorization, signed not by Charles, and not by any official within the Coronation Planning Committee, but by Camilla. At the time of signing, Camilla held the title of Queen Consort Designate, which is the formal position given to the spouse of a monarch between the death of the previous sovereign and the formal coronation ceremony. The title carries no independent executive authority. It is a holding position, a placeholder that acknowledges the role that is coming without conferring the powers that come with it. The document Camilla signed during that period purported to authorize a transfer of custodial responsibility over a specific set of royal assets. The assets in question were not financial instruments, not real estate, not jewelry. They were records, a collection of private correspondence, personal diaries, and internal household memoranda that had belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, and that had been held in a restricted archive since 1997. These were not items from the official royal collection. They were personal papers, designated at the time of Diana's death for eventual transfer to her sons, with a note in the original inventory indicating that no further redistribution of those materials should occur without the written consent of both William and Harry. The authorization Camilla signed transferred custodial responsibility for those materials to a private conservation consultancy based in Edinburgh. The transfer was recorded in an internal logistics log, but was not registered in the main royal household inventory system where it should have appeared. The Edinburgh consultancy received the materials, held them for 11 months, and then transferred them onward to a secondary location in a process that, according to sources familiar with the review, left a documentation trail that was technically present but practically impossible to follow without knowing exactly where to look. William did not learn about this document through any kind of leak or deliberate disclosure. He learned about it the same way many of the most significant discoveries inside large institutions are made. A member of his legal team was cross-referencing logistics entries against the main inventory records and found a discrepancy. A collection of items that should have appeared in 2 separate registries appeared in only one. When the missing entry was traced back through the logistics log, the authorization document appeared at the end of the chain, signed, dated, and carrying the formal seal of Camilla's private office. The first thing William did after his legal secretary placed the document in front of him was to read it twice without speaking. The second thing he did was to ask for every subsequent entry in the logistics chain to be gathered and placed in the same folder. It took 2 days to compile everything. When the complete picture was assembled, it showed that a collection of Diana's private papers, Papers that had been sitting in restricted archive for 26 years and that were designated for her sons had been moved out of direct royal household custody 6 weeks before Charles's coronation, without the knowledge of either William or Harry, without any notation in the main inventory, and on the authority of a woman who at the moment of signing held a title that did not give her the authority to authorize that transfer. There is a layer to this that requires a moment of context, because the timing matters more than almost any other element in the story. 6 weeks before a coronation is one of the most administratively compressed periods a royal household can experience. Hundreds of decisions are being made simultaneously. Staff are operating under significant pressure, coordinating logistics across multiple institutions, managing security arrangements, handling ceremonial planning, and processing an enormous volume of paperwork. In that environment, a document carrying the right formal appearance and the right official seal can move through administrative channels without anyone stopping to verify whether the authority behind it is genuine. The structure creates its own blind spots, and a document moving through that environment during those 6 weeks would have been extremely difficult to catch in real time. That is almost certainly why it happened when it did. William spent 3 days with a complete file before he contacted Charles. Those 3 days matter. They tell you something about how he approached what he had found. He was not reacting. He was preparing. He wanted to understand the full scope of what the document represented before he walked into any room with his father, because walking into that room with incomplete information would have been worse than not going at all. When he was satisfied that the chain was complete, that the document was genuine, and that its implications were fully understood, he made the call. The meeting between William and Charles took place in the private sitting room at Windsor. No advisors were present. No private secretaries waited outside. The two of them sat across from each other in a room that has hosted versions of this kind of conversation going back generations, though very few of those conversations carried quite this weight. William placed the document on the table. He did not open with context or explanation. He let his father read it. Charles read it once. Then he set it down and looked at the window rather than at his son. The silence between them lasted long enough that it had its own quality. This was not the silence of someone composing a response. It was the silence of someone recognizing something they had, on some level, already known was there. What Charles said when he finally spoke is not on any record. What sources close to both men describe is that his first response was not a denial. It was an acknowledgement that he had known about the transfer, though he said he had not understood at the time that it had been processed without the required authorizations. He had been told it was a routine conservation measure. He had not asked to see the paperwork. During those weeks, the volume of decisions crossing his desk made personal review of every administrative document impossible, and he had trusted that the people around him were operating within established procedures. William heard that answer without interruption. Then he asked the question that changed the temperature in the room. He asked whether his father had known that the papers being transferred were papers designated for him and for Harry. Papers carrying a specific note from 1997 saying that no redistribution should occur without their written consent. Charles was quiet again after that question. Longer this time. The answer he gave was more careful than his first. He said he had not been told specifically which papers were being moved or what designations they carried. He said the transfer had been presented to him as an administrative step in preparing for the coronation, not as a decision about Diana's legacy materials specifically. William did not raise his voice at any point in that meeting. People who know him describe a pattern in how he handles situations of this kind. The more serious the matter, the quieter he becomes. The questions get shorter, the intervals between them get longer. It is not coldness. It is a form of control that comes from understanding exactly how much is at stake and refusing to let emotion narrow the available responses. He asked his father one more question before leaving. He asked whether Camilla had told Charles what the materials contained before she signed the authorization. Charles said he did not know. William picked up the document, folded it, and placed it back inside the folder. He told his father that he would need a full written account from the palace legal department of where the materials currently were, who had access to them, and what the process would be for returning them to the custody they were always supposed to be in. He said he expected that account within a week, then he left. That week passed, the account arrived, and it was not complete. The Edinburgh Consultancy's records showed a transfer to the secondary location, but the secondary location's records showed a partial inventory with several items marked simply as off-site for review. Where off-site meant, and what review was being conducted by whom, was not specified. The chain ended there. William went back to Charles with that information. The second meeting was shorter than the first. He placed the incomplete account on the table beside the original document and said that the chain needed to be completed. All of it, not the parts that were easy to follow. All of it. Charles initiated a formal internal review at that point. The review was assigned to the household's legal department with instructions to trace every link in the chain from the original restricted archive to whatever location the materials currently occupied. The review was also tasked with establishing whether anyone other than Camilla had authorized or facilitated the transfer, and whether any of the materials had been copied, reproduced, or shared with anyone outside the organizations involved in the chain of custody. That review has not been completed publicly. What sources familiar with its progress describe is that several of the items designated for William and Harry have been located and are in the process of being returned to royal household custody. A smaller number of items remain unaccounted for in the documentation. The secondary consultancy's records for those specific items are, according to sources close to the review, either incomplete or inconsistent in ways that make definitive conclusions difficult. Camilla was informed of the review through Charles. According to sources familiar with the exchange, her initial response was similar to the explanation William had anticipated. She maintained that the transfer had been authorized in good faith as a conservation measure, and that she had not understood at the time that the materials fell under the specific designation from 1997. She said she had been advised by a member of her office that the materials were eligible for transfer under general conservation provisions that applied to the Royal Archive. That explanation did not close the question. It opened another one. Because if a member of Camilla's office had told her the materials were eligible for transfer under general conservation provisions, that member of staff had either misunderstood the designation from 1997, had not checked whether the designation existed, or had known about it and had not disclosed it. Any of those three possibilities was a serious problem. The first two were failures of process. The third was something considerably more deliberate. The staff member in question was identified early in the review. He had been with Camilla's office for 4 years and had handled a significant volume of administrative work during the transition period. His account of the advice he had given matched Camilla's account of what she had been told. What the review could not establish, and what remains unresolved, is whether his understanding of the material's designation reflected genuine ignorance or something else. For William, the unresolved questions about the staff member's knowledge were secondary to the primary question, which was where the materials were and when they would be back under proper custody. That question was the one he returned to in every subsequent communication with his father's office. The legal and procedural questions about who knew what and when, those mattered, but they mattered less urgently than the physical reality of where Diana's papers were sitting and who had been able to read them. This is the part of the story that has the most personal weight. and it is the part that no official account will ever fully capture. These were not abstract institutional assets. They were her things. Letters she had written and received, notes she had kept, the private record of a life that ended before it should have. They had been sitting in a restricted archive for 26 years, protected by a designation that was supposed to ensure her sons would be the ones to decide what happened to them. And during the 6 weeks before the country gathered to crown the man Diana had divorced, those papers were moved out of that protection without anyone asking William or Harry if they consented. The timing is the thing that keeps coming back in any honest examination of this. Not because it proves that the timing was chosen deliberately to minimize the chance of scrutiny, though that interpretation is available to anyone reading the logistics chain carefully, but because, even if the timing was coincidental, even if the authorization was genuinely understood by everyone involved as a routine conservation measure, the result was the same. Diana's papers were moved without her son's knowledge during the weeks when they were preparing to watch their father be crowned alongside the woman whose relationship with him had defined so much of their childhood. Whatever the intention was, the experience of discovering that this had happened was not a matter of procedure or institutional governance for William. It was something considerably more personal than that. And the way he handled it, the controlled questions, the careful documentation, the formal request for a written account, reflects someone who understood that the only way to get a result from this situation was to keep it inside the bounds of what could be verified, documented, and demanded on record. Anger was available to him. He chose process instead. That choice is not nothing. Charles, for his part, has handled this in the way that Charles handles most things that place him between his wife and his son. He moved when William gave him no option but to move. He initiated the review when William made clear that an incomplete account was not acceptable. He has not publicly defended Camilla's authorization of the transfer, nor has he publicly characterized it as a breach of procedure. He has stayed in the middle, which is where he has spent most of his adult life when these two forces pull in opposite directions. The materials that have been located are being returned. The review continues for those that have not. The staff member who provided the advice to Camilla remains in a position of reduced responsibility within the household while the review is active. And the authorization document, the one that started all of this, sits in the folder William's legal team compiled alongside every subsequent entry in the logistics chain. What does not sit in that folder, and what no review will be able to fully account for, is the experience of whatever the materials contain. If someone read them during the 11 months they were held in Edinburgh, or during the time they spent at the secondary location, that reading happened. It cannot be undone. The words Diana wrote are the same words regardless of who has seen them. The thoughts she recorded, the observations she made, the feelings she put on paper, and the private way people put things on paper when they believe those pages will stay private, all of that passed through a chain of custody that was never supposed to exist. William is aware of that. It is by any reasonable reading of his behavior throughout this process, the fact that sits underneath everything else. The procedural violations are correctable. The review will finish. The materials will be returned. The access logs will be examined, and some version of institutional resolution will be reached. But the fact of what happened, the movement of those papers through those hands during those weeks, that is not correctable. It is simply part of what is now true. He confronted his father because he had no other choice that was consistent with what those papers represent and who they belonged to. And Charles, whatever his private reckoning with what Camilla signed has looked like, chose not to block the review that his son required. That choice, quiet and unannounced as it was, is the clearest signal available about where Charles stands when the weight of both relationships finally becomes impossible to avoid. The coronation is 2 years behind them now. The photographs from that day show the family gathered in the way families gather for the occasions that define them, composed and present, and carrying whatever they are carrying without letting it show. The document that William found was signed 6 weeks before those photographs were taken. What it set in motion is still moving. There is a question that runs under everything described here, and it is one that nobody involved has answered publicly. It is the question of what Camilla understood she was doing when she signed that document. The charitable reading is that she acted on advice she trusted in an administrative environment that was moving at a pace that made careful verification difficult, and that she genuinely did not know the materials being transferred carried a designation that required her stepson's consent. Under that reading, the authorization was a mistake, a significant one, with consequences that have reached further than anyone anticipated, but a mistake. The less charitable reading is available in the logistics chain itself. The Edinburgh consultancy was not selected through the standard household procurement process. Its name does not appear in any prior royal household contracting records. It was a private firm that had no documented prior relationship with the Royal Archive or with any department responsible for Diana's legacy materials. The choice of that specific firm, rather than any of the established conservation institutions that the household uses regularly, is something the review has not been able to account for through any ordinary administrative explanation. That detail does not prove deliberate intent. It does not prove that Camilla knew the designation existed and chose to act in spite of it. What it does is make the charitable reading more difficult to hold on to without other evidence to support it. And that other evidence, something that would show the choice of consultancy was innocent and the oversight of the designation was genuine, has not emerged from the review. William has not made any public statement about any of this. He has not briefed journalists, has not allowed his position to be characterized through intermediaries, has not used the situation in any of the ongoing conversations about his and Harry's relationship with the institution. The confrontation with Charles stayed in the room where it happened. The formal request for documentation went through proper channels. The review proceeded without public pressure from William's side. That restraint is notable because restraint of this kind does not happen by accident in a family that has demonstrated with considerable consistency that it is not always capable of keeping its conflicts private. The choice to keep this contained reflects a judgment that making it public would damage the institution in ways that would outlast the specific harm caused by the original authorization. William is preparing to be king. The institution he is preparing to lead is the same institution that moved his mother's papers without asking him. He cannot afford to burn it down in order to make a point about what was done with those papers. So he works inside it through its processes, using its own mechanisms to demand what should never have needed demanding. That is a particular kind of discipline. It is not forgiveness, and it is not acceptance. It is the management of a situation by someone who understands that the long outcome matters more than the immediate one. The materials from Diana's archive that have been returned are now back under the custody they were always supposed to have. They sit in the restricted section where they have always belonged, under a designation that has been reinforced rather than simply restored, with additional procedural protections that the review recommended and that the household adopted. Future transfers will require a chain of authorization that includes explicit written consent from both William and Harry, regardless of what administrative prerogative any member of the household might otherwise claim. That change is not published anywhere. It did not appear in any official announcement, but it is real, and it is permanent, and it came directly from what William found in that logistics chain and what he did with what he found. The photograph of the coronation still hangs in the formal rooms of every royal residence. Charles and Camilla in gold and velvet carrying the weight of the crowns and the occasion with a composure that centuries of training produce. William and Catherine stand a few steps behind, composed and present. If you look at that photograph and then read the logistics chain and then look at the photograph again, you are looking at two versions of the same day. The public one, where everything was in its proper place and the family stood together as the institution required. And the private one, where a document dated 6 weeks earlier was sitting in an Edinburgh archive, carrying a signature that should never have been there. Both of those things are true at the same time. That is how this family has always worked. Not by resolving the contradictions, but by learning to carry them, one in each hand, in public and in private, for as long as the institution demands it. William carries this one now. The confrontation with Charles happened. The review is running. The materials are coming back. And somewhere, in whatever account Camilla has made privately of what she signed and why, the full answer to the question underneath all of this is sitting, still unspoken, in a room that no review will ever reach. Word count. Approximately 4,200 words. There is one more thing worth saying about how William's legal team found the original document, because it speaks to something larger about the way this institution protects itself from the inside. The audit that surfaced the logistics discrepancy was not initiated because of any suspicion about the Coronation transition period specifically. It was part of a broader effort to bring the household's internal record systems into alignment before the second anniversary of the Coronation, a standard institutional housekeeping exercise that happens after any major transition. The people conducting it were not looking for problems. They were cross-referencing entries to ensure consistency, the administrative equivalent of checking that every item on a shelf matches the number on its label. That kind of work is never glamorous. It does not produce dramatic findings most of the time. It produces small corrections and minor updates, and the satisfaction of a spreadsheet that adds up correctly. The discovery of the logistics discrepancy was not the result of institutional vigilance in the heroic sense. It was the result of someone doing careful, patient, unglamorous work and being precise enough to notice that one number did not match another. That is how the document surfaced. Not through any intentional exposure, not through anyone deciding that the time had come to hold Camilla accountable for something, but through the ordinary mechanism of institutional self-correction. The system found the error because the system was being properly maintained. What happened after the finding is a different story, shaped by the specific people involved and the specific relationships between them. But the finding itself was simply the result of doing the work right. And in an institution that runs on paperwork and procedure, doing the work right is the most powerful tool available to anyone inside it. William understood that immediately. It is why he spent 3 days with a complete file before contacting Charles. It is why every request he made went through formal channels. It is why the review was initiated through the legal department rather than through any personal intervention. The document had found him through proper process. He was going to let proper process carry it forward. That decision, made in the first hours after he saw what was in that logistics chain, shaped everything that followed. The confrontation with Charles was not an eruption. It was a presentation. William brought the evidence, laid it out, and asked for what the evidence required. The personal weight of what he was presenting did not change the form. It changed only the stakes. A father and a son sat in a room at Windsor with a document between them that neither of them had wanted to exist. One of them had signed it, one of them had just found it. The third person it concerned most directly was not in the room and was not going to be called into it that day. And the two men who were there had to decide together what the existence of that document meant for the family they were both trying to hold together, while also being the family that had produced the document in the first place. They reached an agreement of sorts, not the kind that resolves everything, the kind that establishes what will be done next, in practical terms, while leaving the larger questions to settle on their own in the time that follows. The review would happen. The materials would be traced. The chain would be documented. Whatever could be returned would be returned. And the procedures that had made the authorization possible would be changed so that it could not happen again. That is where it stands. Not finished, not forgotten, and not forgiven in any sense that would allow the word to be used comfortably, but contained, moving through its proper channels, producing the outcomes that the situation required. In this family, in this institution, that is what resolution looks like. Not a statement from a podium, not a public reckoning. A logistics chain followed to its end, and a procedure changed, and a set of papers on their way back to where they have always belonged. The document is real. The signature on it is real. What it authorized and when and why it was signed during those specific 6 weeks before the coronation, those questions have answers that only a small number of people will ever fully know. William is one of them now. He did not choose to be. The logistics chain chose it for him. He will carry what he knows the way he carries everything else that falls to him by accident of birth and position, quietly, precisely, and for as long as the institution requires.